Well, welcome all again to one of our Juris North monthly discussions. Jorge here again, simply on behalf of the Juris North group. As I explained before, we decided to carry on the monthly discussions online. Regardless of our universities, all the chairs from Aberdeen to Westminster, we made a decision to keep online the discussions for our safety, the safety of our presenters, and the safety of those who want to join our discussions. Again, regardless of our universities, we made this decision. Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce very briefly our presenter today. Before we do that, for those who are new to our discussions, we follow a sort of Rolfian methodology. We will have one author. The rest of us will be entitled to ask any question we wish. We don't have professors today or students. We are all the same. We are people interested in learning from each other. This will be a conversation for those who are visiting us for the first time. So once again, we have an expert today, and we will be entitled, sorry, Karim, to ask any question we want. This is a discussion, so we all learn from each other. Today, we are lucky to have someone with a legal background and as well personal, practical expertise. We have today Professor Karim Medjad, an international law professor with real life experience. He's a former senior legal expert on Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo. Thank you very much, Karim, or Professor Karim Medjad, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jorge, and thank you very much for having me. As you said, this is supposed to be a discussion, and I'm going to behave accordingly. I'm going to make my presentation as short as possible. As a matter of fact, I have some doubts and questions myself, which I would like to discuss with you. I made a short PowerPoint, which I'm going to present, and then I'll be happy to discuss with you the subjects I'm addressing today. Let me see if I can get my presentation. Okay, do you see it?
Yes, perfectly well.
Okay, fine. This is based on, first of all, I would like to say one word about this paper. This is a paper I started almost 15 years ago, okay? And I decided somehow to rekindle it last summer because of a court decision that took place regarding the Srebrenica massacre, which I'm going to discuss later. It is a reflection that is based on the actual operation of today's protectorates. So the first question, of course, when you talk about protectorate is to clarify what I'm talking about, okay? There are several variants of protectorates, and what is interesting is the fact that they all remain current. All the variants that have been designed in history are still current today and are still being applied today, okay? You have the classic variant, which was developed by empires, okay? So it started with ancient Egypt. The basic idea behind the protectorate is to have a minimalistic monitoring of huge territories. So to do so, you have to exchange a little dose of sovereignty in exchange for some kind of control over the territory you have invaded. So that goes back to ancient Egypt. And you still find the same pattern, which is some kind of puppet government where the local leader stays in place, but is basically monitored by some kind of foreign power. So that applies to, well, from Monaco to today's Abkhazia, okay? And then you have the modern protectorate. The modern protectorate is more a kind of multilateral protectorate. It is modern in the sense that the first version started with Germany after World War II, okay? The first multilateral protectorate is post-World War II Germany, okay? And this has been rekindled after the Cold War, okay? Mainly the most famous are, of course, the post-Yugoslav protectorate, but it started with Cambodia, in fact. I will discuss that a little later, okay? Regarding the terminology, although we are lawyers, I would like to say that there is no such thing as a legal definition of protectorate. So I kept the broadest possible definition, okay? Basically, wherever a foreign power rules, okay, I didn't see any reason to call it differently. And this is why I kept the broadest possible definition of protectorate, regardless of the other terminology that has been used from time to time, whether trusteeship, mandate, and so forth. By the way, protectorate as such has never been used as a legal term. So you find from time to time the notion of protectorates in treaties, but most of the time it is a term that is being used in political science. So very briefly, I'm going to describe here the trajectory of protectorates since their invention by ancient Egypt. Okay, the original protectorate is what we could call a buffer protectorate. The idea being, instead of using walls to protect my territory, I'm going to use extra territories, making the depth of the conquest harder for invaders. So it started with ancient Egypt, but early adopters were afterwards Macedonia, Rome, and later the Ottoman Empire, and of course the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire. Okay, so it started with ancient Egypt. All the major empire adopted it. Okay, and this was the most logical form of organization of huge territories. Beyond a certain size, you need to compromise on the level of control you want to assert on the conquered territory. And this is where protectorates came out. Those that were the most keen in protectorates were those that had a dual purpose, one being monitoring remote conquest, but the other was also self-protection. And this is why Russia, for example, was so keen in developing territories. Russia is a very interesting country because it doesn't have natural protection as would be mountains, for example. And this is why the only protection they have is depth. And their obsession with depth started with the Napoleonic invasion. The reason why Russians eventually defeated Napoleon was because of the depth, because of the time it took to go to Moscow. Okay, and this obsession, this doctrine of the depth is something that is still current today. This is why Russia gets so nervous when you touch to the natural protection of, we said, the buffer layer, Ukraine being one of them, okay? Ukraine, but also the Caucasus countries. So this timeless recipe is still current today in North Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria, but also in Syria. Syria, well, the chunk of Syria that is being controlled by Russia today, which is the official government of Syria, is a typical expression of the ancient buffer protectorate. Okay, it is also something you find in North Africa today. I don't want to get into political debates, but to a large extent, North Africa is the buffer protectorate of Europe. There are things you can do against immigrants, against the southern immigrants in North Africa that you cannot do in Europe. Okay, so there are certain things, a certain level of barbed wire that you can establish in North Africa that you cannot establish in Europe. And to that extent, Europe is monitoring North Africa today. And this is why Libya is such a problem, because Libya is part of the protectorate that went out of control in some extent. This is something you also find in Oceania, okay? The Micronesian islands are part of the US protectorate in Oceania, and so forth. I could go on forever, okay? This is the ancient one, okay? The original one. And then you had later on a deviant protectorate. So the first stage of the protectorate was basically a protectorate that was ex post organization of conquest. So a territory is being conquered and then it is being organized in the form of protectorates. And the deviant protectorate started in the late 19th century, 18th century. It was what happened when Bosnia and Herzegovina was put under the trusteeship of Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary took over Bosnia and Herzegovina as a trustee and eventually decided its annexation. So all of a sudden in history, protectorate became an ex ante, all of a sudden in history, protectorate shifted from an ex post stage of annexation to an ex ante stage of annexation. In other words, protectorate became the antechamber, if you wish, of annexation. And this is what happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnia and Herzegovina was annexated by Austria-Hungary in 1908, meaning 30 years after it was put under the trusteeship of Austria-Hungary. Okay, so all of a sudden you can see the protectorate becoming some kind of transitional status from nothing to a future colony, as opposed to what it was before, from a conquest to a past colony, okay? And this created a very ambiguous legal setting because it created some kind of legal limbo in which you could be a would-be colony, but also potentially a would-be emancipated territory, because the same limbo applied to pre-annexation and pre-emancipation. And this was the legal ambiguity that was created by Austria-Hungary in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this, of course, triggered nationalistic claims on the part of the former colonies of Germany after World War I. And this was immediately put to an end by the League of Nations mandates that were devised by the Treaty of Versailles of 1919. I'll be happy to discuss the legal detail of that afterwards, if you wish. I'm just giving you, a broad overview of the historical trajectory of protectorates. This pre-annexation status has also become a timeless variant. This is exactly what has happened in Crimea, okay? You have some kind of unclear secessionist status that eventually is turned into some kind of annexation, in that case, the attachment to Russia of Crimea, okay? So this was the second variant. And then you have this third variant, which is the postmodern protectorate. You could call that the therapeutic protectorate. It is no longer presented as a colonial protectorate. It is some kind of post-war recovery type international trusteeship that is being established. And of course, the first of them was established in Germany. But you have to look at that from the perspective of three historical milestones. The first is, of course, Germany after World War I. But this logic was only tested once, in fact. It was tested there, and it was extremely successful, but it couldn't be duplicated because of the Cold War. So you had this model, which is the international community taking over the defeated country and turning out into some kind of modern, economically developed country, okay? Germany, modern Germany, okay? This model was used once and then frozen because of frozen because of the Cold War. And this is something that was again in perspective when there was a shift from traditional colonialism to neocolonialism in the 60s, 70s, but again couldn't be used because, again, of the Cold War. And then the Soviet bloc collapsed in the 90s, and it became possible to use it again. It was used then immediately afterwards, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in Cambodia. So the spirit, I would say the so-called post-World War II German spirit was rekindled in Cambodia, but also in Croatia and Macedonia, okay, in the early 90s, okay? Again, something to be, which is presented as a collective protectorate, meaning no blatant colonial ambition behind it because it's collective, and it is supposed to be limited in scope and time. So this model was used, and as a matter of fact, quite successfully. This is why it is not so well known. It was used quite successfully in Cambodia and Croatia afterwards, and Macedonia. These are UN-type protectorates, okay? And then came the Bosnian War, and the Bosnian War turned it into something much more complex, much less minimalistic, and much less limited in time. And then, so this initial intent of a light-handed protectorate became increasingly heavy. And this is where you had, in fact, Bosnia started as a light version, became increasingly complex, okay? And the international community became increasingly pregnant in the management of Bosnia, and Kosovo was probably the first illustration, the first full-fledged illustration of the Bosnian protectorate, which is a total control exercised by the international community with some kind of international governor with an absolute power over people who has no say, if any. So the neo-protectorate at work, as we knew it afterwards, it is what I experienced myself in the Balkan, is an absolutely crazy legal utopia, in the sense that you have an authoritarian bureaucracy, so all the characteristic of a dictatorship, but since it is collective and since it is highly scrutinized, notably by the medias and also by the UN, it is okay. So in other words, you have an utopia where democracy is supposed to come from the collective management, but not from the population, because the population is as absent as ever. Okay, nobody ever asked the opinion of the Bosnian, and when we asked the opinion of the Bosnian, when we didn't like the results, we just canceled the election. This is what we did. We, the international community, a member of which I was at the time, okay, when we didn't like the person that was elected by the Serbs, for example, we canceled the election. There was no question that the election was absolutely correct from a legal point of view. It was just that we didn't like the outcome, so we canceled it. And if you want, I can discuss the extent of the dictatorship. There was one part, in my paper, I mentioned another part of Bosnia, which is less known, which is called the Brčko district in the northern part, where the guy in place was in fact put in place by the US, okay? And he had some kind of governor that not only controlled the parliament, but when the deputies were not voting properly, according to his opinion, the deputies were fined. So he had he passed a decree that was providing for a fine of the deputies that were not voting right. This was the kind of democracy the international community exported with the blessing of the West and the blessing of the UN. Okay. The problem is that on the one hand, we exported a very authoritarian control, but at the same time, we exported some kind of US style legal paranoia in terms of potential liability. So you have, imagine a dictator afraid of being sued. Okay, this is exactly what we create, the kind of Frankenstein monster the international community produced in Bosnia. We produced that in Bosnia, and we produced that even more in Kosovo. So in Kosovo, we had a dictator with absolute power, but a total fear of being held liable because on the paper, his mandate was a temporary mandate, meaning it was impossible, and this is the problem we had in Kosovo, it was impossible to take any measure with lasting effects since it was supposed to be a temporary mandate. No measure with lasting effect means no in-depth measure, meaning only cosmetic measure, including in terms of economic reform. And this is what Kosovo, for a decade, was more or less paralyzed, including regarding reforms that had nothing to do with any political logic, okay? So it is interesting because we created a risk aversion, and this is the spirit we created there, okay? But at the same time, when you look closely at it, you can find it. Any UN-backed intervention still enjoy an absolute immunity, okay? You could call it an anachronism because from a political point of view, it is problematic to have some kind of technocratic administration that is absolutely immune from any of its action. That's problematic from a political science point of view, but it is what we have. Okay, it is what we have. And one question arose in the early 2000s about what happened in Srebrenica. You remember there was this massacre by the Serb militia in Srebrenica, where basically they separated the male population from the rest of the population and executed all the potential warriors of the male population in Srebrenica. All this under the scrutiny of the UN force being a Dutch battalion that was there, okay, and that was supposed to, well, keep peace. So basically you had this Dutch battalion that was supposed to protect the Srebrenica population. The Serb army came, didn't pay any attention to the Dutch forces that were there, to the blue helmet that were there, did what they had to do, which was basically massacred a number of people, and the Dutch army never got proper instruction to do something, so they were unable to protect the population, the civil population. What happened was several years later, of course, you had some of the families of the victims decided to sue the Dutch army in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, the Dutch court said, well, yes, you have a claim because the Dutch army should have done something. And the big question was whether this was potentially something that could undermine the logic of UN immunity. In fact, the Dutch courts never challenged UN immunity. Eventually, they retained an idea of dual immunity, saying that to some extent, to conclude that to some extent, the Dutch troops that were there were liable, but as Dutch troops. meaning they created what they called a dual immunity and considered that the Dutch troops were liable for 10% of the damages, which was the part of liability they had because of their inaction. Okay, but this was a very a very special decision in the sense that it was very local, in fact, and this made the Dutch Supreme Court made absolutely clear that there was no attempt there to the sanctity of UN immunity. So what is happening now, even though for the first time, some of the blue helmets are held liable for their inaction, okay, the UN immunity is not being questioned anywhere. However, because of the symbolic impact of this decision, you could say that Western countries might be deterred from participating in UN-backed foreign administration, multilateral administration of this territory. And that's interesting because the Western countries now are afraid of their own courts. If they're afraid of their own courts, it means that maybe there is some room for some southern countries. Everybody noticed that those ruling Bosnia or those ruling Kosovo were never from the north, okay? Sorry, were never from the south. You could imagine blue helmets from Sri Lanka, but you cannot imagine a governor from Sri Lanka. And this is interesting because this adds somehow to the Western colonial flavor that you find in this part of the world. Okay. Now, does this open room for a governor from Sri Lanka? That's an interesting question. But one thing is clear, there is less would-be protector from the West now. Also, when you look at the territories concerned, okay, nobody wants to go there. Who wants to rule Afghanistan now? Who wants, take today's conflict in High Karabakh. High Karabakh is an extremely difficult conflict, okay? When you look at it, it has all the ingredients of what we found in Bosnia. So there is, politically speaking or geopolitically speaking, there is in High Karabakh the potential for some kind of Bosnia. Who wants to do that today? Nobody. Nobody will want to get involved in High Karabakh. It is going to be something between the Armenian, the Azeris, and some kind of implicit battle between the Russians and the Turkish, but the international community, especially the West, will as much as possible stay away from that kind of conflict. So even creating a new kind of modern protectorate is increasingly difficult because nobody wants these territories, okay? That's another problem, same with Afghanistan, but also same with Yemen, or same with all these countries that nobody wants. Okay, because it is not Iraq, there's no oil there. So what we have now is a situation which is remarkably new. It is new in the sense that protectorates are less appealing for would-be predators, and there is less would-be predators. So for the first time in history, the protectorate market, okay, is shrinking. And for the first time in history, there is an opening where there is a potential for what I call orphan protectorates. This is new. I mean, in 3,500 centuries, this is the first time the protectorate fad is somehow withering, and this was worth mentioning. And this is why I reactivated this 15-year-old paper that I had been keeping for no clear purpose for so many years. Thank you very much. I hope I was clear enough, and I'll be happy to answer any question, especially legal question you might have.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Let me unpin you here. Thank you very much for the presentation. And once again, we are going to start the discussion in a minute. I'm going to stop recording now.